who is this man? So have any of you heard of Godwin's law? If you want to just put in the chat, or, I don't know how you've been doing it today, but raise your hands. And so his name's Mike Godwin, and he's an American attorney and author. And Godwin's law is actually an internet adage that asserts that as an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving the Nazis or Hitler approaches. That is, if an online discussion, regardless of the topic or scope, goes on long enough, sooner or later, someone will compare someone or something to Adolf Hitler or his deeds. And at that point, that's effectively the end of the discussion. And it's since been extended to public discussion or speeches, including presentations. So let's see how far I get with this one. So on the slide, I have support and strengthen deaf and disabled people's organisations, Disability Hate Crime Project. And I have spray painted on a wall an image of a spray paint on a wall saying nothing about us without us. So as Kate introduced me, I am the I'm the Hate Crime Partnership Project Manager at Inclusion London. My name's Louise Holden. And as our name suggests, we mainly focus on work in London. However, we are also part of Reclaiming Our Futures Alliance. That campaigns on a national and international level for disabled people's rights in the UK, and the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. We were set up in 2008, and this hate crime project has been running since April 2018. We are a pan-London deaf and disabled people's organisation. I'm going to say DDPOs just going forward. If you forget what that means, just put something in the chat and I can remind you. So we're the only DDPO that is led by and for disabled people, that campaigns, and we provide capacity building for other DDPOs. So this presentation is going to touch on some theories as to why disabled people are treated differently in society. And we're going to look at some research. And afterwards, I really invite you to have an open and honest discussion about the issues that we're going to be looking at. And really to start thinking about what you can do as advocates to be a real ally with disabled people. As I said, I'm going to read out each slide and then discuss in more detail. And I'm very happy for all of you to have copies of this presentation, including my notes. So my alternative title of this presentation is your key takeaway around disability hate crime. And it says, if you want to understand disability hate crime, work with disabled people. But who are all these disabled people we're talking about? So, disabled with a capital D. Generally, for us in our work at Inclusion London, we are talking about people disabled, and that covers physical impairments, sensory impairments, learning difficulties, long-term mental trauma, distress, long-term health conditions, hidden impairments, conditions, and neurodiversity. So we're using the term disabled with a capital D as a political statement, and it's aligned with the disabled people's rights movement. Now, as society progresses, which it does slowly, as we know, many people with impairments don't want to identify with the term disabled or having a disability because it has negative connotations. But if you understand about when you use the word disabled with a capital D, it has a very slightly different but very important meaning. So if you think of that word disabled with that capital D, it's a shorthand, the barriers that people with impairments and conditions face to live to their fullest potential. So it's a great opportunity this afternoon and afterwards for you to think, how does that relate to you? So during COVID, What barriers have you been facing to live fully? Have you been more restricted to your home? You may not have been able to access fresh food. You might have had to claim some benefits because you've lost your job. You might have had difficulties accessing healthcare. You might have been reliant on friends and family for support if you've got ill. And all of these things, if you've personally experienced it, especially in relation to recent events, these are all things that not all disabled people, but many disabled people have had to deal with for many years. So, building on the work of the DDPO Hate Crime Network, the network was set up in 2016 in partnership with the police to be a critical friend. Disability Hate Crime Matters Initiative. We have currently 22 DDPOs we're working with, and they support approximately 25,000 disabled people across London. 5 of us have specialist hate crime advocacy services. And the aim of our partnership, which is called the London DDPO Hate Crime Partnership, is to develop a consistent pan-London collaborative DDPO response to hate crime and violence against disabled people. So the network and the new partnership that I manage is supported by lots of DDPO organisations that were already involved in hate crime for many years and anti-hate crime work. We have Anne Novis, who received an MBE for her work. She's an independent advisor to the Met Police, and she's also currently our chair of Inclusion London. And we have Ruth Bashall, the CEO of Stay Safe East. And both Ruth and Anne were both instrumental. They're both disabled people themselves, and they were both instrumental with the setting up of the police initiative, Disability Hate Crime Matters. And this initiative led to a 300% increase in reporting on hate crime against disabled people, 2016 to 17. Since this initiative stopped, the reports have reduced dramatically, and we're currently campaigning for the Met Police to make more use of this with their new hate crime coordinators and the general police training. We also work with the Merton Centre for Independent Living, and they lead on development of evaluation and monitoring and research into hate crime in London. And ourselves, Inclusion London, we provide the overall centralised management of the partnership, and we represent the partnership at key stakeholder meetings, and we provide strategic campaigns and policy work. So why have a pan-London DDPO hate crime partnership, disability hate crime partnership? All other types of hate crime have dedicated support. 98%, shockingly, of hate crime against disabled people went unreported in 2015-16, according to Merton Centre for Independent Living research. There's systemic problems with recording, investigation and prosecution. And there's specific needs of disabled people, which has been proven through pilots and research, that they need local holistic, we need holistic services with different ways to access support, not just centralised phone service. So we work under the banner of Nothing About Us Without Us. I don't know if any of you have heard of that phrase before. It's really powerful when you think about it. And there's lots of different ways for people to have safe options to explore what disability hate crime is, how to report and how to recover from hate crime. And we need that range. Having a centralised phone line is just not enough. It's important, but it's not enough. And one of the key things around disability hate crime is that disabled people experiencing it may not actually recognise it as such. And I'll explain more in a bit. But if someone's in contact with their local DDPO, they're more likely to feel comfortable to share their experiences and feel supported to report through the trusted relationships that are built up within that service. And if a disabled person doesn't recognise it, they're just not going to contact a hate crime service. So it has to be through other services, like advocacy services. And as I said, there's 98% of hate crime going unreported, and that was within the Merton Borough at that time. And it may be linked to the low level of confidence that disabled people have in the police, which is on a par with how the Black community feel their experience of being supported by the police. It's a similar level of satisfaction. What's wrong? Official figures state that 8,256 disability hate crimes were recorded by police in 2018 to 19 in the UK. However, the National Hate Crime Survey estimates a true figure of 70,000. Independent research also suggests that as many as 7 out of 10 disabled people experience hostility, harassment, and abuse, for some daily. And there's currently an estimated 1.2 million disabled people in London. So even though disabled people are protected under the Equality Act, they're not a marginalised, they're not a minority group. It's 1 in 5 people in the population, 20% of the population can identify as having some sort of impairment or condition at some point in their lives. So we're talking about a big group of people. So we can agree that these figures just don't add up. It's mostly agreed that disability hate crime is severely underreported and the reasons are complex. And we can discuss those more after this presentation, but the main ones are that disabled people just accept that the abuse is part of everyday life. Might have reported before and had a really negative experience. They might have reported and there's just not enough evidence to pursue a case. And for the disabled people that just accept that that abuse is part of everyday life, they're not going to recognise it as a hate crime, so they're not going to report anything. And even within the police service, a police officer may not realise that they can flag as a disability hate crime if they perceive it to be, regardless of whether the victim does or not. The law is really weak around disability hate crime, and that's why we do a lot of campaigning around reforming the law, and I'll touch on that a bit later. So when you think about this, there's a huge number of disabled people and they're just accepting that they just have to be put up with being treated as less than on a daily basis. And when DDPOs are trying to get funding for frontline services, they're often usurped by larger charities and they're not led by disabled people and local to victims. So there's systemic issues affecting negative bias. Don't worry, keep with me, I'm going somewhere. So on the slide, I have the historic segregation of disabled people, not just seen as inferior, but treated as such. There's discrimination in all areas of public and private life. Others define who we are, if we're vulnerable, an easy target, or if we're being taken advantage of. And there's an internalisation of negative perceptions by individuals, including people who are identified as disabled. And that sort of becomes the social norm. And there's a very weak application of current legislation. For example, the Equality Act. A disabled person would have to bring their own case as an individual. And obviously with the changes with legal aid, that's really difficult. And the policies and practice that link disability and vulnerability. So disabled people have been treated differently throughout history. If we think about in our own living memory, how disabled people are separated from their peers into special schools, how disabled adults are excluded from the workplace and placed in special work schemes. I didn't know I was so special. And what we're talking about here, though, is a societal norm of how out of sight and out of mind just becomes how it is with disabled people. I went to a mainstream school and there were no disabled students there at all. So I didn't know any disabled people. It was only when I became disabled in later life that I realised, you know, what had been going on. So how disabled people and children, sorry, let me start again. How disabled children are not considered to have similar aspirations as their non-disabled peers. You may not agree with that, and how ignorance and mistrust can lead to hostility and hatred, and it can creep into a person's mind when thinking about disabled people. And if you think honestly, and I do it myself, it's when I think about a disabled person, do I think that they need my help? Do I think that they're vulnerable? And, you know, sometimes do I think that they're deserving of my pity? According to Godwin's law, this is where my presentation ends. So on the screen, there's Acton T4, which is the Nazi program that slaughtered 30,000 disabled people. Way before the Second World War and any triggering of Godwin's law, there he is, he's just popped up again. The Enlightenment era was the eugenics movement, and this originated in the UK. These ideas were based in racial inequality, but also physical and mental differences or defects that had to be eradicated. And this is quite chilling for me on a personal level, because when I read through the list of people that were being eradicated, I would have been on that list. And all this is vital if you want to really understand how systemic issues affect disabled people today. And it's all linking to why we use disability with a capital D. We are disabled people. And seriously, this is a really great example of how dialogue and debates are shut down about complex social issues with this use of, it's, you know, a jokey Godwin's law. How uncomfortable conversations are just not dealt with. They're shut down. But surely we've moved on from all this. Well, unfortunately, not so much. So on the slide, there's a picture of Baroness Jane Campbell, and it includes a statement, which I'll read out in a minute, that Baroness Jane Campbell, a long-time disabled activist, made at an online event about the impact of COVID-19 on policy responses relating to the treatment of disabled people in healthcare settings. And I'm just going to read the statement out. So she said, vulnerability simply serves to anonymise our humanity and human rights. The use of frailty scoring to prioritise treatment and GPs ringing round to ask the vulnerable if they wanted to consider a do not resuscitate on their notes, it began to feel like there was a very short walk from being one of the vulnerables to the chilling club of one of the expendables. But can we really believe that disabled people will be treated like this in the 21st century? So I'm carrying on with systemic issues affecting negative bias. And on the slide, we have several screenshots of the same news story about an MP that was recorded as saying that she thought that people with learning difficulties should be paid less than their non-disabled peers. So these are all news stories from last year, and they're relating to one particular MP who said that her comments were taken out of context. This doesn't matter because the way it was reported has already done the damage, and it feeds into this narrative that disabled people are inferior and therefore can be treated differently. But it's not actually fair of me to just pick on one MP about a non-story, about something that she said she didn't say, is it? Big reveal. On the screen, I'm just going to click through so you can see it. So on the screen, I have a screenshot of 5 popular newspapers, and I will go through what it says on the screen as I read through. So In 2010, Inclusion London commissioned the Glasgow Media Group and Strathclyde Centre for Disability Research to carry out a study to analyse changes in the way the media are reporting disability and how it has impacted on public attitudes towards disabled people. In carrying out the study, they compared and contrasted media coverage of disability in 5 papers, 2010 to 11, and a similar period in 2004 to 5, which are quite politically significant because they had different administrations in those time frames. And they ran a series of focus groups. So what did this study find? An increased level of reporting around disability. That sounds good. But its politicians were increasingly influencing the news. That's not so good. And if you believed what the papers were saying, disability benefit fraud was absolutely huge. Spoiler alert, it isn't. So, and the focus reports reported that they thought benefit fraud was a lot higher than it actually is. The articles were having an effect on public attitude towards disabled people. So these news stories are reporting on political rhetoric that uses language to describe disabled people as benefit scroungers, that they're making a lifestyle choice, that they're fraudsters, and it links these really negative terms to disabled people. So we've all heard of the adage, we are what we eat, but surely we are what we read. It really worries me that everyone sits down on the bus and picks up the metro. That's just my personal bugbear. So these are all main popular newspapers in the UK, and they really don't have positive to say about disabled people. It just doesn't sell papers. So I hope you're starting to see the link between the systemic issues and how these still prevailed and how disabled people are viewed, spoken about, and reported on. And all this affects policy and practice on every level. So turning the tide, our work, we have campaigned for many years on parity and clarity in hate crime law legislation. Hate crime law is incredibly weak and confusing when it comes to disability hate crime. We provide submissions of evidence based on what deaf and disabled people organisations tell us. We work with social media companies. We support DDPOs to set up local hate crime services. We support DDPO staff dealing with hate crime. We represent the London DDPO Hate Crime Partnership. We are developing a training resource for frontline staff, and we run a big annual learning event focused on disability hate crime. And part of Inclusion London's capacity building work as part of the hate crime project includes specialist advocate support, hate crime advocate secondments, which means that if an organisation wants to find out more about supporting around the issue of disability hate crime, they can request a secondment for 6 months. The submissions on policy are, for example, about online harms, the impact of COVID, and we offer business support for fundraising and securing services. And we really make sure that disabled people have a voice at key stakeholder meetings, which include the Mayor's Office for Police and Crime, the Metropolitan Police, and the Crown Prosecution Service, as well as others. And our big learning event is open to everybody, and we would love it if some of you here today could come. We're aiming for it to be held in February 2021, probably online, but hopefully not. It's a great opportunity to hear directly from disabled people who work at DDPOs about the challenges and achievements that they've had over the year. And as I said, we're developing a series of training modules for frontline staff to be delivered by disabled trainers. And this is currently delayed due to COVID. But my main message about DDPOs are that having a sustainable and funded local service that is led by and for disabled people not only prevents helps prevent hate crime, but it also strengthens communities and improves inclusion, diversity, which are the key aspects of a healthy society. And it helps to dismantle those long-held prejudices that other and demean disabled people. So we launched a new report. It wasn't this week, it was during National Hate Crime Awareness Week. And the report is called Still Getting Away with Murder. And it was written by Dr. Laura Chapman, who is herself a disabled academic. And it's building on the work of a report that came out in 2008. It was the first report that was led by disabled people around the issue of hate crime against disabled people. And it looked at murders that were prosecuted but not recognised as due to a hostility or hatred towards a disabled person. So 12 years on, Dr. Laura Chapman reviewed all the research and all the work that had been going on. And these are her 6 key findings. And I really encourage you to read at least the summary of the report. The report itself is quite long. If you have the time, it would be really good for you to read it. But we do have a summary as well of the report that's available on our website. So the 6 key findings are that disabled people are still overwhelmingly likely to be victims of crime. 10 years on from when Laura was reviewing this is not enough for drastic change. And disabled people are still seen as unreliable witnesses. This is something that advocacy really supports with, is getting that person's voice respected and believed. Laura found that using a human rights-based approach really aids the increased understanding of disabled people's experience. She found that institutional disableism creates space for hate crime. I mean, that is such a short sentence and it means so much. Disableism has the same characteristics as other isms, and more work is needed to improve understanding. And the one that is one of the reasons that as a disabled person myself, I am employed to do this work is that co-production with disabled people really works. When we have worked with the Metropolitan Police, for example, when they came to our big learning event, they learned more in that afternoon than they had through years of hearing about what they thought the experience was. When they actually listen to people who have gone through it themselves, they get it, they get why it's so serious. So in brief, more needs to be done to build a fluency around the culture and society and an understanding of disableism and ableism, practice and policy, and it's all in line in the principle of nothing about us without us. So on this slide, it's DDPO is a key to tackling disability hate crime. And this video was funded by the Office, Building Stronger Britain Together, linked in-kind support, and shows how a local DDPO can work to tackle hate crime in partnership with the police, council and health. And this particular DDPO is called Dazzle. I used to work there, and this is the sign for Dazzle that Deborah might know, and it's based in Lambeth. So I'm going to attempt to play the video now, and I really hope it works.
Louise, just as can you stop sharing the screen?
I can, yeah.
Excellent. Right, here we go.
Hate crime is where somebody is specifically targeted for their disability. It could be abuse, it could be antisocial behaviour, a bit of name calling or a bit of pushing and shoving. It's massively underreported nationally in London and in Lambeth that people are forced to leave their home, they're attacked, sometimes even killed, purely because they're disabled.
It's not just something that happens to individuals, it happens to us as disabled people as a community. But there are organisations locally that can be there to help. One, just to let you know you're not on your own and it's not just happening to you, but also where to go and where to get help, where to get advice. and linking in with how to report disability, hate crime and behaviour, but to get the social support if you've been a victim of that as well.
One of the unique things about an organisation like Dazzle is that because they're led by disabled people for disabled people and they have a wide range of services, they provide holistic support. So if you're talking about someone who's been a victim of hate crime, it's highly likely that they won't recognise it as such. So they might come into Dazzle to access help with benefits, or they're being evicted from their flat. And when they get to know the workers at Dazzle, they'll actually disclose how they got into that situation, and it could be a situation where there's hate crime involved.
We don't work by ticking boxes, we work with the individual, and we will tailor what they need to what we know about them. Our staff are disabled people, our trustees are disabled people, we have disabled volunteers, so it's very likely if somebody comes in to report a disability hate crime, they will be working with a disabled person. So they're talking to a peer, they're talking to somebody who understands, they're talking to somebody who may be able to share lived experience. We'll then work with the person, I guess, to understand what their rights are, what their options are. Do they want to report it to the police? If they do, we can support with that, but there's no pressure to do that. We can report things anonymously if that's what the person wants, or it can just, like I say, be a place where people can feel able to open up about their experiences, understand, come to terms with any negative incident that they've had, and hopefully then allow them to move on with their lives.
Okay, you can take the screen now, Louise.
Great, thank you. Okay, can you see the screen now? Okay.
Yeah, looking good.
Yeah, great. Okay, yeah, I'm so sorry to keep harping on about it, but you know, this, I mean, when I found my local DDPO, it literally changed my life. So, you know, after being, after the car accident, I had a lot of rehabilitation to do physically and mentally, and finding an organisation that knew what that experience was like, and you know, gave me hope for my future, really. And you know, so when I feel really passionate about this, that you know, if someone is experiencing a hate crime, you know, they really need advocate support, and any advocate. But if it's based within a DDPO by a disabled person, then they can work with the other services in that DDPO. And you know, what I learned from working at Dazzle for about 11 years was that we really built up trust, and the way that trust was built up was because we shared the experience of being disabled. Even though each disabled person is obviously individual, we all have our different journeys, but we had a lived experience of that power dynamic that happens when you become seen as somehow less than. And the DDPOs can support to report with that specialist knowledge. But I think the most important thing that I learned was the recovery from it. And the way that happens is because of the holistic services that the DDPO provides that aren't linked to hate crime services. It's social networks, a whole, you know, employment, you know, a whole range of things. So unfortunately, Dazzle then lost their funding for their specialist hate crime advocacy, but they do still help disabled people to report and access support via what's known as the Catch Partnership. So if you're based in London, you can refer a disabled person to the Catch Partnership. If you just Google that, it will come up. But also, if you're not based in London, you can contact them and see about the local provision in your area. And Dazzle have continued to run a regular hate crime partnership, so it's keeping it on the agenda. Something's happened to my screen.
You okay? Is it not moving forward?
It's not moving. Yeah, hang on. I'm going to try and share it again. We're nearly there. We're nearly at the end.
All right.
Right. No, it's just not working. Could you share it, Kate? Have you got it there?
It'll cost you, but yeah.
Oh, I've only got a couple more slides to do, and then I'm really keen to hear what people think about what I've been talking about.
Okay, sharing now.
But yeah, my screen seems to have frozen. Sorry.
Sorry, don't worry. Here we go.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Yeah. So this has a picture of Mark Smith on the slide. Mark made multiple calls for help because friends had changed locks on his flat and taken it over. There was multi-agency involvement. Safeguarding alerts were raised multiple times. There was absolutely no connection made to cuckooing or hate crime. And cuckooing is when so-called friends take over someone's flat and use it for criminal activity. And most importantly, Mark wasn't referred to a local DDPO, and he was murdered by this friend in 2018. And this happened in Waltham Forest. They conducted a safeguarding review in 2019 after the series of failures for the joined up working. And the NHS, the police, the Housing Association and social services were all involved in supporting Mark, but none of them made any connection to hate crime. And if they had, they would have referred to Stay Safe East, which is a local DDPO in Waltham Forest that specialises in supporting victims of hate crime and cuckooing. And this is an absolutely shocking example of how the types of cases can start low level, be mistaken for something else, and then escalate. So part of what I was saying around DDPOs is how to recognise those low level signs sooner and stop it from escalating. And I know that Ruth Bashall, the CEO at Stay Safe East, has been in touch with all of the local agencies and continues to work with them to try and identify cases like these sooner. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is a message from Anne Novice. We have a photograph of Anne and her PA. And I think she's just about to give a speech at the Disability Hate Crime Matters Conference, and this was held in 2016 at New Scotland Yard. And I'm just going to read out Anne's, the extract, the quote on the slide. "Making a lasting and consistent difference is my goal. It is no good if I leave as an advisor or officers move on and the work stops. It has to be integrated into everyday practice for all police services. Third-party reporting, multi-agency work in boroughs, advocacy, support for victims through the justice system can only be successful if deaf and disabled people, victims and our own organisations get involved in this work." So this is a really powerful statement made by Anne, who received her MBE for her tireless campaigning on combating disability hate crime. And I feel that what she says relates to all agencies and organisations, not just police services. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm tapping away, I'm not, I'm not in control of that. So this is keys for combating hate crime. We're all affected by negative bias. Being aware is the first step. Working with disabled people breaks down these barriers. We need integrated strategies across commissioning for community, police and health. And really mind your language, it's just a little cheeky. So from my point of view, working at Inclusion London, we're really encouraged by the engagement that we've had with the Met Police and the Crown Prosecution Service. And we have ongoing discussions around the use of the social model of disability and changes in terms like vulnerability. They all start the building process to bridge those barriers. And we really hope when we have our frontline training programme developed by a woman that's not too far away from this conference as I speak, that I really encourage that you'll be able to book yourselves on and start building those bridges. So, final slide. So we have a wall with spray painted message saying nothing about us without us. So we're known for delivering those local services with a holistic approach and really aids victim recovery. And if you just remember one thing about today, if working with disabled people is the best way to combating disability hate crime. Employ us, fund us, and develop those integrated strategies. Thank you very much. I look forward to having a really good discussion with you all.
Well done. Okay, guys. Thanks. So take a breath. That was brilliant.
Have some water.
So lots of comments in the chat box, and I think people thinking deeply about people that they might be supporting. And we've also got people who are kind of questioning whether they've experienced disability hate crime in their own life and maybe not recognised it as that or labelled it as such. So let's get your questions coming through. I'll start with Louise, who says, I'm all for the social model of disability, and I prefer disabled with capital D instead of person with a disability, because I feel that puts the disability aspect on me, when being disabled can mean disabled by society. What are your views on this? I think we know them.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. I think, I was reading a BBC news article yesterday, and it was, seemingly good about, tackling issues around disabled people. But then they were interchanging the terminology all the way through, and I couldn't get where they were coming from. So I think you've got to be consistent in how you talk about and use the term disabled people. Me personally, I didn't want to be a disabled person. I just wanted to be seen as everybody else. And it was only when I got involved in this sort of work that I actually felt quite a little bit proud, a little bit turn it on its head. And that's all to do with the social model. I mean, social model's been around since the 80s. Yeah. So things are going to change. There's going to be new models. But I think in terms of not individualizing it and seeing it as society's issue, it's a really important step towards challenging that politically to get change. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I feel like I've got on my soapbox now.
Stay on it. Is there a specific or clear definition of what's considered to be a disability hate crime?
That's such a good question. We were going through it yesterday. So there is, you can go onto the Crown Prosecution Service website, and they have a really good definition according to the current law of what it is. Just so you can go and have a look on there. There is ambiguity around it because the law is so weak around how you prosecute. So different types of hate crime are treated differently in law, and the Law Commission are currently looking at reforming the law to make it more equal. But I would say a really clear definition is on the Crown Prosecution Service website, if you look at that.
But it's all
I don't know if you want me to say.
Well, yeah, I think it's helpful just to explain that it's about motivation, isn't it, Louise? It's if the offence is motivated by hate and disability. So
yes, so disability hate crime doesn't exist in of itself. So when it's related to disability hate crime, so it can be any crime that is committed that, when investigating, is shown and proven to be motivated by a hostility towards that person because they are disabled. So it can be any crime. Yeah. And then when the person's prosecuted, they will get an uplift in their sentence. So all of the murders that were reviewed in the Getting Away with Murder report, the perpetrator was convicted, but they didn't get the uplift in sentence because it wasn't recognised as due to hostility.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Nia's asked if you're aware of any groups for, let me just pull her question, sorry. Yeah, are there any forums for disabled advocates to get together to discuss issues and advocacy that they face as disabled advocates?
Well, you know a little bit about that, Kate, don't you? So we as part of Inclusion London's work, we've been offering a whole range of support to hate crime advocates that deal with hate crime against disabled people, because obviously as a disabled person there's intersectional issues as well, so they can be victims of other types of hate crime. Yeah, and I've been working really closely with yourself, haven't I, Kate, about offering that support. So, which I think is really key, because it's quite impactful work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Nia's question highlights that there might be a gap, because of course your work's in London, isn't it? It's pan-London.
Yes.
You in Wales, I think, from memory. But yeah, maybe this is something as a community we need to think about how we
Yeah.
support, and how disabled people kind of come together, and disabled advocates come together to offer that support for themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, could I just say, if they are based in Wales, they could contact Disability Wales, which is sort of the equivalent of Inclusion London. We don't have Inclusion England, but we have Inclusion Scotland and Disability Wales, and they may find that Disability Wales might be able to help them get funding to set up their own group.
Brilliant, thank you. A question around signage have suddenly popped up saying not all disabilities are visible. Do you think there's any discrepancy in reporting hate crimes between people with physical and other forms of disability?
There is a discrepancy across the board of people's experience. So I know a lot of people that maybe wouldn't identify as disabled that experience discrimination, bullying, harassment, all sorts of issues, which can easily escalate. And it might be because they're perceived as different. So what you've got to remember as well is that the person doesn't even have to be disabled, it's a perception. So you might ask why someone's targeted if they have a hidden disability, because you wouldn't be able to see that they were disabled, but it might be over a period of time that they're identified as somehow being different. It's very common for especially disabled men, if they live alone in social housing. This is a very common factor, that they're labelled as a paedophile in their local community, and they're othered. And there's been numerous cases where the person's been physically attacked and lost their life, sadly, due to this persecution. But I think if you think about the number of cases that go through to the Met Police and reported, it's just across the board. And I think the impact of hate crime is that just the fear of it happening will change someone's behaviour. So they might avoid using public transport or going out, just because they may not have even experienced it, but it's just the fear of it.
And there's been instances, hasn't there, Louise, where then people's behaviour can become perhaps more unusual, and it's then like a cycle then, isn't it, where people attack that person more, maybe not physically, and then the person responds in unusual ways, which then attracts further attention. And I'm thinking of the person we talked about who thought that somebody was they bang on the wall because they thought the neighbour was recording them and shouting at them. So then that caused the person to then bang more on the wall, which kind of made it just increased everything. But it was like this vicious cycle, and until somebody stops that cycle, it often then results in a lot of tragedy.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, so a question: in our region, disability hate crime appears to have the least successful prosecutions. Is this the same in London? Any thoughts?
It is. It is. There's a really good study by Dr. Mark Waters. I think it's Sussex University. I can find it. I can put a link in the chat. And
it was Dr. Mark Waters.
Dr. Mark Waters.
Okay.
Sussex University,
Yeah.
and is 2%. So it's on a par with rape cases that go through the criminal justice system. So you can go through the whole process, and it's only 2% of cases that actually get prosecuted. So it's across the board, and we're looking at how we can find out a little bit more about why that is. It's so complex. One of the things.
Is it called Hate Crime and the Legal Process?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
Got it. I'm going to put the link in the chat box because Google is amazing.
I know. What did we do before Google?
Right. The Equality Act doesn't appear fit for purpose when protecting the rights of disabled people or children. What can we do to get that reformed?
Well, I mean, Inclusion London, especially during COVID, it really highlighted the inequality that was happening, and then the resulting abuse and potential hate crime that happened through some really simple things like queuing up to go into the supermarket. So across the UK, there were a group of organisations that have actually come together to support a massive group of individuals to take the main supermarkets to court under the Equality Act for not making reasonable adjustments. So, I mean, I think if I could wave a magic wand, I would say that with the Equality Act, it needs to be enforced by bodies. We need to have proper enforcement by the commissioning bodies that oversee the Equality Act. That just doesn't happen at the moment. So second best, smaller magic wand would be free legal support to disabled people that want to challenge any discrimination. But it doesn't seem fit for purpose, though. I agree. Yeah.
Right. We've got a question from Chloe. Chloe, let me unmute you. Chloe, feel free to go if you can. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the question and just interrupt us when you're ready. So Nicholas asks, is there an overlap of disability and mental health prejudice? And does this impact responses of services?
Sorry, was the question, is there an overlap with mental health prejudice?
Yeah, with disability and mental health prejudice. And does this impact on how services respond?
Yes, I mean, short answer, yes. So something that we discovered through our project was that a lot of Met Police officers don't even consider that someone experiencing a mental distress or trauma would actually even be considered as a disabled person. So they don't even see that they're being targeted because they're disabled. So it's massive lack of understanding, which we're working to improve. And I think, I mean, it's a compounded problem, isn't it, with the reduction in funding for services. So the police seem to be not just enforcing the law; they're there to protect us and uphold the law. But especially in London, I've heard of cases of someone who's in mental health crisis being driven around for hours in the back of a police van until they can find a bed, to put them, which is absolutely horrendous. So I think it's a similar issue. It's what I was sort of alluding to around, disableist views, and just seeing the barriers that someone in mental distress would have to overcome to be able to access justice. You know, there's the lack of recognition by maybe themselves or the services, and then all the way through the criminal justice system of they might be seen as an unreliable witness. You know, so there's lots of issues there.
Yeah.
Kate, I'm ready when you are. Sorry.
Go for it, Chloe.
Zoom
Hi,
doesn't
Chloe.
take- Hi. Yeah, Zoom doesn't take disabled people into account either.
I know.
So that's why I was a bit longer.
Don't worry.
Basically, mine wasn't really a question, but more of a comment to say that I think it's also important to mention that sometimes what ends up being a hate crime and turning into a massive issue can actually start off as something quite well-meaning, because somebody who's sort of committed that act or said that thing is actually ignorant to the damage they might be causing. And if that's not flagged and left for a long period of time, that's when it can then become an issue. Just to use an example of a friend of mine with a new PA that I had, at this time she was providing support to me as well as him. And he's slightly sort of on the autistic spectrum, we think, but he's got learning disabilities. And she was dropping him off at his house, and he said to me, "Do you need me to give you any money?" Because I dropped him off, and he only lives around the corner from me. So I always say, you know, of course not. I'm your friend. But as a joke, my PA unknowingly said, "Oh yeah, that'll be £7, please." And he went, "There's some money in Chloe's house that I've left there. Take it." And I was like, "Just watch." I said to the PA after, "Just watch what you say to him, because he will take you literally. And if I hadn't have seen that and flagged it, every time you'd have driven my car, it would have been giving you money." And sometimes this can happen because there's nobody there to say, "Hang on a minute, they're only joking," or "they don't actually mean this, they mean that." Maybe where we can, we need to be flagging up the little issues first to make sure that they don't then escalate.
Oh, Chloe, that's such a good example. One of our partners in Camden, Camden People First, they developed a role play scenario of a low-level situation around money and how that can escalate. And it's such a good example. It really is.
There's all sorts of things, because particularly people with learning disabilities, but some other people with disabilities as well, because they have been socially excluded, they will take a lot of things more in the literal sense. So you really, without sounding patronising, you really do have to be careful what you say, because the way it's interpreted can make so much of a difference to how people are treated.
I totally agree.
So that's where we start as advocates, is to make sure that we're understanding our clients correctly.
I totally agree with that. That's such a good point, Chloe. And I'd just like to say, I mean, we were talking about it the other day. It's like the difference with the social model. It's like you're being victimized or you're a victim. It's like the social model is that you're being victimized.
But sometimes the person who makes you into a victim does it unknowingly because they're actually trying to help you, but that isn't realised because of the misunderstanding that comes between. So I'm not saying it is the case every time. There are some awful people out there, and there is a lot of hate crime that's done knowingly and with intention, but quite often it can also be because of ignorance.
And I think that one of the main things that I've learned is that a person isn't inherently vulnerable just because they're disabled. It's a situation that anyone can find themselves in. So, you know, if I lose my job and I live on a housing estate and I end up on benefits and my friends don't want to come around anymore because, you know, I've got economy tea bags, and I'm talking from experience here. This happened to me. You know, I end up being isolated on that council estate and lonely and stressed. You know, and if someone shows me a bit of kindness, you know, I could end up in a really challenging situation just through because I needed to connect with someone. You know, would I ever think that was a hate crime?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Chloe. I'm just really conscious of time. So very quickly, I'll put in a link, Louise, I hope that's okay, to the pyramid of hate. Because I think that's a really useful way of thinking how benign acts and just that kind of low level unconscious bias can, when it goes unchecked, then allows, you know, genocide to happen. You know, essentially that's what it goes to, isn't it? So do check that out. And the last question, comment to Wayne, if that's okay. Are visual impairment and learning disability amongst the highest percentage of hate crimes? Because he imagines that both groups of people can have issues such as not being believed, taken seriously.
Yeah, I think there's the Dimensions charity, which is a UK charity, and they that's where I got those figures from, that they estimate it's 70,000 people. It's not broken down. The Met, I'm only going through London wide, so the Met Police do not break down by impairment, so they will just say this is the number, and we need to do more research into who's targeted. Anecdotally, when I worked with clients in Lambeth, there was a lot of targeting of people with learning difficulties and a lot of really sad stories of people, visual impairment, being followed home or befriended and then, you know, having their houses robbed and stuff like that. So, but I can't give you official figures. I don't know.
Thank you. Well, we have overrun, which I'm not surprised because it's such an important topic and something I think advocates feel very close to the heart. So can I echo everybody's thanks to Louise for an excellent session, really great.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure, Louise. And
love to come back.
Please do. And we'll talk about it all the time. And I think the week-long event, maybe we can do something formal next year where we're connecting the advocates up to your celebration and that training event.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your conference, guys.
Well, we've just got one session left at 3:30, which is our question time. And yeah, I'll see you there then. Thanks again, Louise. Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Chloe.